Most people watching this already know a lot. That's important to say up front. You're not uninformed, you're not asleep, you're not unaware. You've read the books, listened to the talks, done the work. You understand identity, self concept, inner states, and emotional processing. And you probably even have a vocabulary for all of it. And yet, if you're honest, something hasn't moved. Not externally, not in a way that matches how much insight you have. That's what we want to talk about today. Not from a motivational angle, not from a therapeutic one, but from a structural one. Because there's a very specific pattern that keeps intelligent, self aware people stuck, and it hides something that looks like progress. And what we're talking about is the modern healing journey. Now, let's be clear from the first. This isn't an attack on healing itself. There are moments where processing, reflection, and self inquiry are necessary. But there's a point where healing stops being a phase and becomes an identity. And once that happens, movement slows down, not speeds up. You can always tell when the shift has happened because life becomes conditional. You start telling yourself things like, once I get past this, I'll move forward. Once I feel more integrated, then I'll commit. Once I heal this part, then I'll finally live fully. What you may not realize is that every one of those statements quietly postpones authority. They frame your life as something that happens later, and reality begins to respond to that framing with brutal consistency.
One of the most uncomfortable things to confront is that the healing journey often creates a role that feels responsible but functions as a holding pattern. The role of the perpetual patient, the one who is always working on themselves, always in process, always almost ready. And from the outside, this does look admirable. You seem thoughtful, reflective, conscious. You're not reckless. You're not reactive. You're doing things properly. But internally, it creates a subtle paralysis. Because if your primary identity is someone who is healing, then your life never quite gets to begin. There is always one more thing to address before you're allowed to move decisively. And here's the part that most people don't want to hear. That identity doesn't persist because you're broken. It persists because it is actually familiar to you, because it gives you language, because it gives you justification, and because it protects you from exposure. As long as you're healing, you don't have to fully commit to anything. You don't have to risk being seen. You don't have to test who you are without explanation as a buffer. Healing becomes a socially acceptable way to stay unfinished. And the moment you start naming yourself as unfinished, reality takes you at your word.
True. And once the healing identity is in place, something else tends to appear almost automatically. An entire ecosystem designed to support it. Courses, retreats, teachers, modalities, frameworks, each one offering language, structure, and reassurance. Each one suggesting that the missing piece is close, just not quite integrated yet. Now let's be precise here. The problem isn't that these things exist. The problem is how they're used. For a lot of people seeking help, quietly turns into deferring authority. Instead of asking, who am I choosing to be now? The question becomes, what haven't I addressed yet? And that question keeps you looking backward. The mind loves this because it feels productive without being risky. You can keep learning without committing. You can keep refining without deciding. You can keep preparing without stepping into consequence. And here's the contradiction for conscious reality creators. You understand that experience reflects assumption, that life reorganizes itself around identity. But then you treat identity like something that comes after enough work has been done instead of something you choose and then live into. As long as the answer is out there in another conversation, another method, another insight, you don't have to stand in the discomfort of self authorship. You don't have to say, "This is who I am now," and live with what that requires. Seeking becomes safer than choosing.
This is why people often confuse sincerity with effectiveness. They're genuinely trying, they're genuinely engaged. They're not avoiding growth in the obvious ways, but avoidance doesn't always look like distraction. Sometimes it looks like dedication. There's a particular comfort in being guided, in being told what stage you're in having your experience explained by someone else's model. It removes uncertainty. It also removes responsibility. Because if the framework says you're still integrating, then it makes sense that nothing has moved yet. If the process says you're in transition, then waiting feels justified. And waiting becomes normal. What's rarely questioned is whether these external structures are actually producing forward momentum or simply making stagnation feel meaningful. Because meaning is soothing. Meaning explains why things are hard, or meaning validates the pause. But reality doesn't respond to meaning, it responds to state. At some point, there's an uncomfortable realization that many people have but don't want to face. You're not missing information, you are postponing decision. And decision is threatening to the healing identity because decision collapses the idea that you're still in progress. Decision says, I am willing to be seen without qualifiers. I am willing to live without a disclaimer. That's not a healing move. That is an authority move. And authority is exactly what the healing identity keeps just out of reach.
At some point, the problem stops being what happened to you and starts being how much energy that you're spending arguing with what is. That is where the idea of radical acceptance becomes unavoidable, and also where a lot of people misunderstand it. Radical acceptance is not passivity. It's not pretending you like your circumstances. It's not saying everything is fine when it clearly isn't. It's much less comfortable than that. It's the refusal to keep negotiating with reality. Most people don't realize how much internal resistance they carry as background noise. Thoughts like, "This shouldn't still be here. I should be further along by now. This means something is wrong with me." None of that sounds dramatic, but it creates a constant state of friction, and friction is a state. For conscious reality creators, this matters more than almost anything else. You cannot create from a state that you refuse to inhabit. If you're mentally somewhere else, waiting, resisting, correcting, then your body and nervous system are still signaling dissatisfaction and delay. Forced positivity doesn't solve this, it just buries it. You can affirm all day long while quietly arguing with your present experience. Reality responds to the argument, not the affirmation. Radical acceptance cuts that loop. It says, "This is what's here now," without turning that fact into a verdict about who I am or where I'm allowed to go next. That shift removes a huge amount of internal noise. And when the noise drops, something else becomes obvious. You're not stuck because you're wounded. You're stuck because you keep postponing presence.
This is where things get uncomfortable because acceptance removes one of the last hiding places. When you stop resisting your experience, you also lose the justification for waiting. A lot of people think they're holding back because they don't feel ready. And yet, in reality, they don't feel ready because they're holding back. Readiness is rarely something that arrives on its own. It's something that forms after movement begins. When you accept your current state without trying to fix it first, there's often a strange stillness. No problem to solve, no story to refine, no identity to protect. Just you here without explanation. That's confronting because presence removes the narrative that says, I'm still becoming. It asks something much sharper. What are you doing now? Acceptance collapses the waiting room. It takes away the excuse that says, once this changes, then I can move. And once that excuse is gone, responsibility returns. This is why people sometimes resist acceptance more than pain. Pain can be explained, pain can be processed. Acceptance demands authorship. From this place, action stops being reactive. It's no longer about fixing yourself or proving something. It becomes an expression of coherence, of alignment between who you say you are and how you actually move through the world. And that's where identity starts to shift. Not because you healed something, but because you stopped delaying embodiment.
There's a moment in every self development path where insight stops being helpful and starts becoming a delay tactic. Not because insight is wrong, but because it has already done its job. It has shown you the pattern. What remains is choice. A lot of people confuse understanding with transformation. They can explain themselves in detail. They know why they react the way they do. They can trace their habits back to formative moments and name every influence along the way. And yet, their external life remains largely unchanged. This is where analysis quietly replaces agency. As long as you are focused on why you are the way you are, you don't have to confront what you are choosing now. Explanation keeps you in observer mode. Action requires participation. Observation is safe. Participation is exposed. For conscious reality creators, this is a critical distinction. Reality does not reorganize itself around insight, it responds to behavior. It responds to what you enact consistently, not what you understand privately. Action is the language identity speaks fluently, and this doesn't require dramatic reinvention or reckless leaps. In fact, small, unglamorous actions are often the most powerful because they bypass the mind's ability to negotiate. They're harder to romanticize and harder to avoid. Every action you take answers a quiet but decisive question: who am I being right now? If you continue behaving like someone who is waiting to be ready, that identity stabilizes, regardless of how much awareness you possess. If you act like someone who trusts themselves to move, even imperfectly, a different signal is sent. Identity doesn't update when you understand something. It updates when you live something.
There's also a subtle perfectionism hiding inside healing culture that rarely gets named. The belief that you must resolve internal tension before you're allowed to move externally, that you must feel aligned before you act, that you must feel certain before you commit. That belief sounds quite sensible. It's also paralyzing. Movement does not require certainty, it requires willingness. And willingness usually shows up after you start moving, not before. This is why waiting to feel different before acting almost always fails. Feeling follows behavior far more reliably than behavior follows feeling. Confidence, clarity, and coherence are not prerequisites for action. They're byproducts of it. When you act without resolving every internal question, something recalibrates. The body updates first, the nervous system adjusts, the mind follows later with a new story that matches what you're already doing. Small, consistent actions create evidence. Evidence reshapes identity, identity reshapes experience. This is the part people try to skip. They want the internal shift first and the behavioral shift second. But identity doesn't work that way. It stabilizes through repetition, not reflection. At some point, you have to let your future self justify your courage rather than waiting for your past to explain it. Action collapses abstraction. It removes the luxury of endless contemplation and replaces it with lived consequence. And lived consequence is where identity actually changes.
There's a moment where this conversation has to stop being theoretical and start being personal. Because at some point, the healing journey stops being something you're on and it becomes something that you're hiding behind. The most destabilizing idea you can introduce after years of self work is not that you still have something to fix, but that you don't. That idea threatens the entire structure that you've built around becoming, around preparing, around staying just slightly out of reach of full commitment. Because if you're already whole, then delay stops making sense. Wholeness doesn't mean your past disappears. It doesn't mean difficult experiences suddenly feel resolved or enlightened. It means they stop functioning as evidence against you. They stop deciding what you're allowed to claim, attempt, or embody. A whole person does not wait for permission to live. They don't require a clean emotional state before moving forward. They don't postpone embodiment until every internal sensation feels resolved. They move while imperfect. They decide while uncertain. They act without a guarantee. And here's the part that needs to be said plainly. If you continue to define yourself as someone healing, you are choosing to remain in transition. Not accidentally, not unconsciously, actively. You are choosing to keep your life provisional, to keep your authority delayed, to keep your identity just out of reach so that you never have to fully test it in the world. No final milestone is coming. No internal alarm will ring to announce that you are ready. That expectation keeps you waiting in a corridor with no exit. There is only now, only movement, only choice. And if you don't choose, you're still choosing, just in favor of what's familiar.
This is where the conversation ends, not with reassurance, but with responsibility. The healing journey does not end when you feel finished. It ends when you stop identifying as unfinished. That's not a feeling based decision, it's an authority based one. When you stop treating yourself as a problem to be solved, life doesn't respond with comfort, it responds with consequence, with space, with demand, with opportunity. Momentum begins the moment you stop explaining yourself and start embodying yourself. And that can feel confronting because it removes the story that says, I'm still working on it. It removes the safety net of perpetual preparation. It leaves you face to face with what you're actually choosing. But that's also where power returns. Not some mystical power, not motivational power, practical power. The power that comes from coherence between who you say you are and how you live. If you've been waiting for a sign that it's time to stop circling your own history and start participating fully in your life, then this is it. Not because you're healed, because you're done postponing. And what you do next is no longer a healing question, it's a responsibility.
If this conversation challenged you, let it travel. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's been circling the same questions a little too long. And make sure you hit the bell so that you don't miss what's coming next. We're not here to comfort old identities, we're here to question them. Until next time, think differently, dream boldly, and create consciously.